Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Calland. I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center here at NC State University in North Carolina. I want to welcome you all to our webinar today, Pollinator-Friendly Solar. Someone was mentioning just a minute ago as we were talking amongst ourselves, the panelists, that this is actually long enough. It probably should have been called a symposium rather than a webinar, but we've got a lot of great information, and just judging by the number of folks that have signed up for the event today, seems like there's a lot of interest in the topic, so we're looking forward to it. Just logistically, before we get into it here, down in your viewer here for the GoToWebinar, you'll see a tab that says handouts, and there are several handouts there, including bios for all of the speakers and some other information that we've put together for today. We are recording today's webinar, and so it will also be available in its entirety on the web soon, and we'll talk a little more about where that's going to be located towards the end here, I think. So again, my name is Steve Calland at the Clean Tech Center in North Carolina. This effort for us really kind of grows out of some work that we've been doing in the state to support better relationships between the solar industry and local governments and the local agricultural communities. It hasn't been that relationship has been bad, but there's always more to be done to try and make a solar project a more integrated part of the local communities in which it is located. And so, we've been doing work at the center, reaching out to local governments and helping them with, appropriate language for permitting and zoning issues. We've been working with them on tax issues and the tax implications of solar projects. And this is all important in North Carolina because of the fairly unique nature of our solar market. Most people don't think of North Carolina as a hotbed of solar unless you're really in the industry. But North Carolina is actually the second largest solar market in the United States behind California. And it has kind of an unusual shape to it, to the market. Whereas in California and many other large solar states, there's a mix of residential, commercial rooftops, and utility scale solar projects. In North Carolina, we are not exclusively, but very largely tilted in the direction of these utility scale solar projects. And for many years in North Carolina, this was driven by PURPA rules in the state, the federal language that basically asked utilities to purchase renewable energy from solar companies at an avoided cost rate. And in North Carolina, we had a set of rules that made that a particularly favorable transaction for projects just under 5 megawatts. So we have literally hundreds of 5 megawatt and smaller utility scale projects in the state. And many of these projects are scattered across the significant agricultural areas of eastern North Carolina. So while we were, looking at ways to help, improve the business climate for solar to, work in a collaborative fashion with the agricultural sector, this idea of pollinator-friendly solar projects was brought up to me by a gentleman by the name of John Morrison with Ecoplexus, which is a developer that's active here in North Carolina as well as in many other states. So John kind of raised the issue to me first. I'm sure others were already thinking about it, but it led to a conversation this past spring where we decided to convene a number of players in the solar industry and in the agricultural industry, including some folks from North Carolina Cooperative Extension that were experts on apiaries and on other native flora and fauna, as well as biologists from some of the other universities in the state, and a whole array of folks from the environmental community and the solar industry. That work group was really just getting started, and we unfortunately had to put it on hold for a while due to state budget cuts this year. But we are in the process of trying to pick this effort back up again now, and so this webinar is really the kickoff of that process. Just real quick, I did want to thank, in particular, a couple of people here. Certainly John Morrison, who kind of got the ball rolling, and also Greg Andek, my co-host with Audubon, North Carolina. Greg has been a great partner in driving this forward and helping to provide some logistical resources to us to get this done, including organizing a lot of the speakers for this panel. And so, Greg, thank you, and we really appreciate your help in moving this forward and your efforts. I also would be remiss if I didn't thank a couple of folks on my own staff, Kimberly Conley, who handled a lot of the logistics in getting this set up, and Ashut Surezdra here, who has helped me get going this morning. Unfortunately, for a guy who works in the solar industry, I'm somewhat of a Luddite on these issues. So having folks, that are here at the center that are more technically talented than I is a big plus and a blessing. So with that brief introduction, I want to throw it over to Greg so he can make some comments as well. But I hope everybody enjoys the presentation today and finds it useful. And certainly we will be doing a survey in the next few days after this to get a little bit of feedback. But if there are issues that you see with the presentation or information you'd like to get, then certainly don't hesitate to provide that to us when we do our survey. All right, Greg, to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. I really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Yandick, Director of Strategy and Government Relations for Audubon, North Carolina, which is the state office of the National Audubon Society. And really appreciate, Steve, your leadership and the leadership of the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology, putting this webinar together, and the information sharing that really started back in June in the meeting that Steve and his team convened with a number of industry participants and advocate groups that have been working on native plant issues in the state. And so we're excited to continue this conversation here. Audubon has really made this issue a priority because birds and other pollinators benefit greatly from native plants as solar installations. But even more important, we believe that in North Carolina, it's one of the strongest rebuttals to an argument that we sometimes hear from a fairly small group of individuals at either our legislature or even in some counties that may claim that solar is bad for agriculture or not great for some of our rural communities. And in our eyes, there's no better rebuttal to that argument than with a bird and pollinator-friendly solar farm that can really be positioned as an asset to local farms and the local community. Audubon has been working on native plants for a number of years. We have a Plants for Birds program that you can go and visit on our website, where we actually allow homeowners and businesses to look up native plants by their zip code. We also work with about 90 different nurseries and retailers in North Carolina to make sure that they have native plants available for those folks when they come knocking on the door. And so we've really been focusing on matching supply and demand within the potted plant, native plant industry. One of the things that we've seen here in North Carolina is that we have this classic supply and demand challenge with native plants from seed. And while demand is growing for native plants on solar farms across the country, there's not always enough native seed supply or even qualified technical expertise within the landscape contractor community to perform successful native plant installations at scale. And so really these webinars and information sessions are meant to bridge this gap, not only in North Carolina, but in other states. And we're really excited to be part of this movement. And so if you're interested in supporting or contributing to future webinars or information sharing, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Steve or any of our other organizers here. It looks like we have over 150 people on today's call and a lot of information to share. So we split today's webinar into 2 hour-long sessions. The first hour will provide more of a broad overview of pollinator-friendly solar and some of the general trends in the industry. And then the second hour, pardon my pun, will go a bit more into the weeds and is more of a technical practicum to share installation best practices, opportunities, and challenges for native plants at solar installations. Before I switch gears here, I just wanted to really recognize a friend and colleague that Audubon has worked with for a number of years, Rob Davis of Fresh Energy. Audubon worked with Rob in Minnesota to pass the first pollinator-friendly solar standard in the country. That effort was led by a leadership group of Republicans in the state, and I'm really delighted to have Rob from Fresh Energy here today to share his expertise and also to introduce our other speakers that will be discussing their work and what they're seeing in this field. So, Rob?
Thanks so much, Greg. It is really a pleasure to be here with you and Steve Calland for this fantastic conversation today. Really excited to help solar companies bridge that conversation and accelerate the change that they want to make in the world by understanding more about what folks in agriculture are really looking for with seeing agriculture on some of these projects. And with that, I think I'd like to actually go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker. He actually is he's not with us in person today, so you won't be able to ask him questions. He's in a state committee meeting, but Steve Levitsky is the Vice President of Sustainability for Purdue Farms. They're nationally and globally, they're one of the largest companies producing organic poultry. They're headquartered not too far at all from North Carolina, just up in Salisbury, Maryland on the Eastern Shore. And they have a pollinator-friendly, or what will be a pollinator-friendly solar array adjacent to their headquarters. And certainly for most folks, before I turn it over to Steve and play his remarks, I just wanted to highlight that within poultry industry, there's a tremendous amount of demand for electricity, as well as soybeans, which are the number one source of protein in a chicken's diet. So I encourage everyone, at a later time to go ahead and find Steve's commentary, which ran both in USA Today and in GreenBiz on the business case for pollinator-friendly solar. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Steve. He reports to the chairman of Purdue Farms and is really a leader among his peers in agriculture related to solar and the benefits it can provide.
Hello, I'm Steve Levitsky, Vice President of Sustainability for Purdue Farms. Purdue Farms is a large food and agricultural company. Our headquarters are located in Salisbury, Maryland. We have operations in Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Washington State, California, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. I wanted to talk today about pollinator-friendly in your solar site. I think this is something that was introduced to us via Fresh Energy, a NGO out of Minnesota, which Rob Davis will be speaking today too, I believe. Purdue has several solar sites, one at our corporate headquarters and one at one of our feed mills, and we're also looking at developing more sites. Most of I would say probably all of our operations are in heavy agricultural areas. So this marriage of pollinator-friendly and solar sounded like a very interesting idea to us. After being introduced to it, we found many positives with doing this. As we push for more solar and more renewable, in order to reduce our carbon footprint, we just think it's something that kind of has a multiple win scenario. Because we're in agricultural areas, and because we're also looking at solar in these areas, we thought it was a perfect match. About 75% of agricultural crops require pollination of some sort. Studies found large increases in yield of the pollinator habitat located adjacent, and up to 80% increase in yield for squash, and up to 24% increase for soybean. And soybeans are required ingredient for poultry feed. So again, there's from the ag side, putting pollinator-friendly habitat beneath solar panels. You're taking that acreage that may be taking away from agricultural production, but you're then increasing yield to adjacent agricultural land, which is, I think a good offset while also producing renewable energy. Another positive aspect to planting pollinator-friendly species is the improvement in soil and water quality. The certification here in Maryland that was developed, and it's something that's also developed and used in Minnesota, and is being pushed to other locations like North Carolina. They're looking at native, low-growth, flowering plants to capture nutrients. And the plants have deeper root structure. They improve the organic matter of the soil and the soil tilt. So you're getting some improvement in soil and water quality beneath the panels, along with getting the pollinator habitat that the pollinators would use above ground. And then, and finally, as I said before, adding renewable energy to business, farmers, public added megawatts is something that, from a business standpoint, is positive for us because we're trying to reduce our carbon footprint as Purdue Farms, but also from the farmer's aspect, in two ways. One being that poultry farmers use a large amount of electricity to heat, cool the houses, and then you have the other positive with putting PV on agricultural lands. It's a diversification of revenue for a farmer. So if they have areas of the farm that they don't get great yields on, they can put solar panels on and actually get paid for that acreage. And if you plant it with pollinator habitat, then you're increasing the yield on the adjacent farmland. So it's a win-win, and then you're producing renewable electricity that can be used at the farm, or in our case, at our processing facilities. I think the positive again from our aspect is we're at I think about 3.5 megawatts of solar capacity right now. We want to be up into the 30 to 50 megawatt range in the near future, and to be able to do something that we think is positive in multiple aspects would be a great aspect to putting more solar on the ground. We're working on planting our site here at our corporate headquarters, the 1.8 megawatt site. Currently have some bids on that development, and we're looking forward to doing that in the near future. And then on the other areas we're looking at putting solar, we're making that part of the PPA contract that the solar developer, instead of putting gravel or turf grass down, will put a pollinator-friendly habitat down. And if there's not a certification within that state, and we're just having them follow the certification that was developed for Minnesota and Maryland, just so there's some criteria that the developer can follow and make sure that we're meeting certain minimum requirements for pollinator habitat. The bill here in Maryland, because we thought it was a great positive in all aspects of agriculture, renewable energy, business, we backed the certified pollinator-friendly bill. And it actually went through the Maryland legislature, I believe, with 100% positive vote from both sides, House and Senate. And so it was just, all around, I think no group had any major concerns or issues with the bill, and put it right through the policy procedure. At the end of the day, I think that the big thing to take from this is that we see it as a win-win-win-win scenario. It's good for renewable development. It's good for the environment. It's good for increasing crop yield, and it's good for business. So it just in my own personal opinion, and also I think in our company's opinion, there's just really no reason why you wouldn't want to do pollinator-friendly habitat around your solar panels if you have the ability to do so. There's just a lot of positives that come from doing this. I just recently listened to an NPR piece where they had talked about shipping bees from Midwestern states, I think it was Nebraska, to California in tractor trailers, and then release the bees to pollinate for, I think it was almond tree. And so it just seems like a very unsustainable type of situation where we have to transport pollinators over 1,000 miles to pollinate tree species or other plant species when you can hopefully develop this habitat to keep up populations local to the crops and trees that need pollination. And this is again a perfect opportunity to produce solar and to have pollinators present to help yields and help pollinate plant species that feed us and others. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for listening in, and good luck with your solar/pollinator project.
So that's Steve Levitsky of Purdue Farms. In the rest of my comments today, I just want to highlight this is Rob Davis. We'll have Eason Case from Cypress Creek Renewables, one of the nation's largest and fastest growing solar developers. And then Jordan Macknick, national leader and analyst, an expert at the National Renewable Energy Lab, talking about low impact solar development approaches and his work on a DOE funded study related to co-location of agriculture and solar. So in the rest of my time today, I want to share some information about the urgency driving this issue. And it's really, and also establishing some common language so that we all know kind of roughly what we're talking about. Here is a picture of a pollinator-friendly solar array. You know, this practice is only recently imported to the United States. The solar industry here obviously got its start in mostly in the desert Southwest, and so we're catching up because there's been a lot of civil engineering templates that have been copied from the Southwest and just applied into other states. But there certainly is an abundant opportunity to interpret this work based on work that's been going on for years and years throughout the United Kingdom and throughout Europe. This picture is of a pollinator-friendly solar array about 100 miles outside of London. So when folks in agriculture express concern about solar, it's sometimes because it looks like suburban development, but it's also sometimes because it looks like this project that was recently permitted and approved and powered on, in Ohio. And so you can see clearly there's an opportunity to plant some vegetation based on what's growing outside of the array area, but then within the array area, there's gravel which is used, and so that's potentially an opportunity. You certainly can't blame a farmer or someone living in the agricultural landscape for expressing some serious concern when they see some projects that look like this. And certainly these kinds of images are shared widely in the media. So even if your individual project may not look like this or be proposed to look like this, just know that the people are finding these pictures out there because there's a number of projects that take this shape and form. Meanwhile, here in Minnesota, there's this project that actually OLakes is a subscriber to. This is a pollinator-friendly solar array south of the Twin Cities, and then there's other projects. The characteristics of these projects is simply that there's a high performance seed mix, and there's as much engineering, thought, and mindfulness paid to the seed mix and to the vegetation management plan as there is to the engineering that goes into the design of the panels and the silicon and the performance of the array itself. So it's not just good for pollinators, obviously. These deep-rooted native plants, provide significantly superior stormwater performance. You can see on the left here the depth of turfgrass roots versus the depth of native grass roots. So that's an opportunity for every solar developer to have a conversation with that local authority to ensure that there's credit given, so that you don't necessarily have to waste money on building a stormwater retention basin if you're using plants that have these kinds of vegetation characteristics. For farmers, this is also really important because over the 25 years of the project, these native plants and forbs are going to significantly add organic matter to the soil, improving the quality of the soils over the life of the project. And that's the land stewardship is a really important value in the agricultural sector, where there's unfortunately a lot of misinformation about solar causing heat island effects, and those studies do exist, but they're limited to Arizona. There's other studies out of the United Kingdom that show 5 degrees Celsius cooling in the vegetation on native plants on solar sites. So when you're designing for high performance vegetation, you can certainly have a number of those performance improvements. And it's not just good for stormwater and soils and pollinators. It's also, as Greg mentioned, critical for birds. And this is just another opportunity to connect with another audience. There's birders out there that are looking for ways to help the native birds. Those native birds feed their young with the bugs that have co-evolved with native plants. So these kinds of grasshoppers and caterpillars and things are not interested in turf grass. There's nothing there for them in turf grass. But with native plants, you'll find a diversity of native bug species, and that's exactly what birds need to survive, particularly in the face of a changing climate. But coming back to really getting to the detail about agriculture is I think we all know or have all heard about the plight of the honeybee. Significant losses, colony collapse disorder has been a major concern. Even still today, the U.S. federal guidelines put out in 2015 established a goal of maintaining the honeybee loss. The annual honeybee losses are at around 15% of hives nationally. Currently, we're still losing around 33-34% of all honeybee hives, representing more than 900,000 beehives, dead beehives. And the situation is unfortunately similar for a critical species of bumblebees. More than a dozen species of bumblebee face the risk of extinction within our lifetimes even. And obviously this year we just had the rusty-patched bumblebee be added to the endangered species list. We know that when those species, those sensitive and important species are added, that in the business community that results in significant changes to business processes and costs. And so it's not just obviously about each of our individual conservation ethics and the importance that we place on these personally, but it's also about the spreadsheets and the costs that are driven up when we have to when species are at risk of extinction. Obviously, in agriculture, pollination is the name of the game, and 75% of the world's crops significantly benefit from pollination. You'd be surprised at the number of ways. So even just a simple common fruit salad made with these ingredients, these specific ingredients, 2 apples, some blueberries, raspberries, and strawberries. A fruit salad made with these ingredients represents more than 1,000 individual visits by bees to pollinators, by bees to flowers. So that's literally 2 to 4 individual visits by pollinators to apple flowers, 2 to 3 visits per blueberry, 5 to 6 visits per raspberry, and for strawberries, it's remarkably 20 or more individual visits by pollinators to flowers to produce one market-ready fruit. This situation is significantly amplified for coffee and chocolate and things that we love. But to maximize the yield of coffee, you need pollinators. And so in the picture here in the upper left, those are coffee cherries. So you need 20 to 40 visits, from bees to flowers to get one coffee cherry, which results in 2 coffee beans. And that ultimately means that just a single cup of coffee each day is the result of the harvest, representing about 1,000 individual visits by bees to flowers. So it's an extraordinary amount of work that bees provide. And it's not just that these crops are dependent, it's that these crops actually increase their yields. So without pollination, either fruit and vegetables don't grow, or they're significantly smaller and misshapen. And it's not just about the value that can be added from managed honeybees, as we all think about, the apple orchards maybe that have honeybees that are delivered, or certainly the almond crops and the honeybees that are all, transported across the country to pollinate those crops. But also, the abundance of wild pollinators significantly benefits agriculture. And simply by having that habitat is the way to increase the abundance of native pollinators. In China, where that's not common, farmers have to pollinate by hand. They lash chicken feathers to bamboo rods and then go around and actually do the pollination work of these pear and apple trees. So also in agriculture, beekeepers managing honey-producing hives that are adjacent to pollinator-friendly solar arrays are significantly, their harvest is significantly improved by having access to healthy forage for their bees. So in Minnesota, there's a company, the Solar Honey Company, that is marketing and promoting a line of solar honeys that are really site-specific for solar array. So this is all the different ways that agriculture can coexist with solar. With that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to a beekeeper himself, Mr. Eason Case with Cypress Creek Renewables. Eason?
Rob, thank you so much for the intro, and I'm really happy to be a part of this webinar. I think Rob let me know that I was the only beekeeper presenting on this call. I hope I get corrected on that. I'm also a former employee of the NC Clean Tech Center, so especially happy to be presenting on this webinar, and really glad that my former colleagues have honed in on this topic. So at Cypress Creek, I can engage in regulatory and legislative shifts, and in that role, I have a longer-term view of changes in markets, and that's, aside from being a beekeeper, that's really how I got personally really involved in this issue. Before I dive into why my company is interested in this topic, I'd like a little bit of an intro. So Cypress Creek Renewables is the second largest utility-scale solar developer in the country, and I believe we're on the top 10 list of the largest solar construction companies in the world. When we're talking about utility-scale farms that we build and own and operate over the longer term, we're talking about site sizes of roughly 5 acres to several hundred acres. One thing that I think sets Cypress Creek apart from maybe other solar companies is that we are heavily involved in every part of the utility scale development value chain. So, we will get sites from the beginning, we'll design and build the sites, we'll finance the sites, and then we'll also plan on owning them and operating them over 30 to 40 years. There are many companies that are involved in each piece of what I just mentioned. Cypress is one of the few that is involved in every single piece of the development process. Since starting 3 years ago, we raised over $2 billion and have reinvested that in over 2 gigawatts of solar We own now 1 gigawatt in about 8 states and have sold several hundred other megawatts to others, and then we're developing in over a dozen more states. So we're very active, and we see a lot of changes in many markets. So given that we're this big, fast-moving company, why do we hone in on pollinators? Well, we saw a similar problem in all markets that posed to, business challenges everywhere, and that was this agricultural impact perception that Greg and Steve alluded to, where, regardless of, I think the truth of the situation as we see it as developers, there's this thinking that a solar farm sited in an agricultural area somehow subtracts from the agricultural economy. And, we as solar companies will show up and we'll share our talking points on that, and we'll say, well, what about other types of development? And shouldn't people be able to develop how they want to on their own land? Shouldn't they have that freedom? But ultimately, I think anybody who's achieved a successful long-term relationship recognizes that maybe perception matters sometimes more than truth. And so we found in this pollinator-friendly strategy a solution, a long-term solution to this problem that we're seeing all across the country. And instead of just words, we now can offer a long-term, impactful investment that enhances the surrounding agricultural economy, in addition, of course, to our words, which I'm sure we'll continue to deliver as we face these challenges. So that's really, I just want to be clear that this isn't coming out of thin air. This is a business problem of national scale for the solar industry, and this is a really good solution for it. So how did we get started on pollinators? Well, I was glad to hear that we have an NREL expert following my presentation. We were actually inspired by an NREL webinar, and first honed in on this in January of this year, so we're relatively new to this. I was able to track down an intern at Duke University. Olivia Askew is her name, and she's done an excellent job in helping us put together an implementation plan. But this entire topic area really moved so quickly that Cypress is already at a stage of implementing sites and pollinator-friendly farms. But to get to this point, we've done an internal cost-benefit analysis, which is critical for any business. And the conclusion of that was that pollinator-friendly habitat can be thought of as sort of an LED bulb solution of operation and maintenance costs. There's a higher upfront cost for installing pollinator-friendly habitat, but there is definitely value over the longer term to capture that savings in terms of essentially less mowing. It's not quite as simple as that. There are some unique risks to pollinator-friendly habitat and installing it that I'm sure Stokor can speak to much better than I can. But we did recognize it as something that over the longer term we could capture value from. And I'd just like to acknowledge that, as a larger owner-operator involved in every single piece of the development process, like I mentioned before, sort of, local approvals, designing and building the site, owning it over the long term, we were uniquely positioned to kind of capture that value as we're thinking ahead and integrate this into a strategy. And that would be harder for any company that was, just doing one piece of that work to implement pollinator-friendly work. So as we were having this conversation internally, we realized that there is value there, but it also required a little bit of intentionality, because despite the fact that there is some potential value over a long period of time to be captured, it's a relatively minimal value when you're thinking about a solar farm pro forma than say other things we might be able to do on a site. And it's relatively small cost item. So there really does have to be this intentionality to choose this as a strategy as a larger company. And there are, I think, ways, both external conversations that can be had and internal conversations that can be had to move more companies towards making this choice. So now that Cypress has made this choice, where are we now as a company in actually making pollinator-friendly habitat happen in more places? Well, we're at a very nascent stage, like the entire industry here. We're still trying to figure it out. One thing that has been truly indispensable and critical in helping us integrate this into, multi-department business changes has been these flexible solar pollinator site indexes or scorecards that several states are putting together. And I think Rob just put up a slide about this. You can kind of, as you take a look, see sort of the individual pieces of exactly what is on this form, but it really does give us a template that we can directly respond to as a business and integrate each one of these considerations into all of our decision-making processes, which, and there are many, from, how to design the farm, how to talk to local zoning authorities, which particular vendors we should work with to procure the right types of seeds, who we should work with to actually prepare and manage the land before we build, and then also in the longer term after we build, and then how we're maintaining it, what kind of chemicals we're using on the land. One of the results of this, and taking a look at these scorecards, is that we have, for all of our sites, adopted a no harm policy when it comes to neonicotinoids. And those are seeds that are treated with a pesticide in advance of being sown. And it certainly does, I think, cut down on the use of pests, but it also has a very negative impact on bees. And it's something that I think people have been considering significant regulation on, and maybe they have passed it in a few states. As a beekeeper, it's very concerning to me, the impact of this chemical on bees. And so I'm really glad that my company has adopted a stance to, at the very least, protect the bees, and then also looking forward, trying to integrate exactly how we're going to approach this issue in the future and into our strategic thinking. So this scorecard has also allowed us to develop particular sites. We're working on one site in Maryland, in Baker Point, where we're going to have a ribbon cutting, and the power is going to National Geographic, and we have local state representatives coming, and we hope to have a big media splash on this that I hope you all have on your radars. And it's going to be one of our first pollinator-friendly solar farms. And at this point, we wouldn't have really been able to do this, and our contractors wouldn't have been able to do this without the scorecard that the Maryland government put together, and really gave us the signals we needed to credibly design a pollinator-friendly site. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there's leadership outside of industry that I think needs to happen to move this along, and I hope that we can have more conversations like this to help us arrive at this point. In addition to Baker Point, we also have several other sites in the work right now, including in Minnesota, one in North Carolina, Texas, and New York as well. So we're thinking broader than Maryland and thinking nationally, but generally, just like everybody else, we're at a nascent stage. This is not yet a mainstream business practice. It's one we hope should get to the mainstream. But before I let you all go, I would like you, as we're thinking ahead about how to get this potentially to the mainstream, an issue that we've honed in on that we could really use some help in thinking about, and there's this issue of a limited native seed supply. And that is, we're a little concerned that if this catches on too fast, then the limited seed supply will actually raise the costs, that upfront LED cost, if you will, to a point that makes this a tougher thing to do. Because it takes a season or 2 or 3 to scale up the native seed supply. So we're definitely not at a chicken and egg situation now with the native seed supply, but looking ahead and, as a beekeeper, hoping that this becomes a mainstream business practice, this is definitely kind of a core economic issue that we need to resolve before we get to having this be a common industry standard. And I'm sure others can speak to that on the call, but that's one thing I hope you all chew on as you're considering this issue. Thanks so much, and welcome questions later on at the appropriate time.
Thank you so much, Eason. Really, really appreciate your leadership and Cypress's leadership on this topic. And just to chime in, it was very delighted earlier this year to be in Washington, D.C. for an event hosted by EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, a national group of some of the largest utility companies in America. They have launched a formal pollinator initiative, not just for solar arrays, but also to examine practices and ways to benefit pollinators under and around utility transmission and just distribution line corridors. So there's a ton of attention to this seed issue and a lot of folks working on it at local level and at the federal level. And so now I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Jordan Machnick. Jordan and I had a webinar about almost a year ago, and have just really enjoyed getting to know Jordan's work, and have great admiration for his thoughtfulness and his leadership in designing tools and studies that can really accelerate this and help solar companies realize the significant economic benefits of moving to a low impact design approach. So with that, I will hand it to you, Jordan. I believe you have control now.
Great, thanks, Rob. Can you see my screen all right, Rob?
Not quite yet. Oh, wait.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Great. Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for having me be a part of this webinar. I really appreciate it. I think it's a great opportunity. We are really excited to see all the development that's been happening at such a fast pace in the solar industry related to this topic. And I personally am excited for the next hour of this webinar, where we get to hear the industry perspectives on this. So I will keep my remarks brief, but I do think it is important to let people know about what we are doing at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, along with our other laboratory, academic, and industry partners on this topic of low impact solar development, including pollinator vegetation in solar arrays and the co-location of solar and agriculture. Just so people are aware of what's going on and the complementary activities that we are providing to the industry on this important topic. And really, I think what it boils down to is that we are trying to provide the robust quantitative data that is necessary for this topic to really expand even further. So what we've seen is a number of forward-looking companies adopt this approach. A number of forward-looking companies really take this on, to the fullest extent. And as we go forward, we're going to see a lot more companies do this, and they're going to want to see a lot more quantitative data on the actual outputs and performance and cost trade-offs, and that is really the driver of what we are doing at the lab. If you're not familiar, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is part of the Department of Energy, and it's the only national lab that's dedicated solely to energy efficiency and renewable energy. but we partner with other national labs, and we've been around for the past 40 years, evaluating clean energy in all of its different forms, technology development, deployment, and renewable energy integration. This is an exciting project for us, where we are collaborating with a number of folks. And the project itself is called the Innovative Site Preparation and Impact Reductions on the Environment, or INSPIRE project. And this, the topic of pollinator-friendly habitat, as well as incorporating vegetation underneath solar arrays, is just really one key aspect of this project. But I do also want to note that we are, in addition to this, looking at, if we do have environmental impacts, how can we best and most smartly address those through mitigation, through compensatory mitigation, and through mitigation planning. In addition, we are also looking at innovative siting locations. So this might include siting on contaminated or disturbed lands, integrating it cleverly with other agricultural operations in different configurations. All of this is being done through extensive stakeholder engagement, lots of feedback from landowners, from state agencies, from industry, to try to really provide these solutions that are most relevant and keeping pace with the fast developments in the industry. So again, I'll focus mainly on the pollinator-friendly habitat and the vegetation underneath solar arrays, but it is part of a much broader system view of solar development in the United States. And one of the driving motivations that we've seen is solar is booming, and you know, we've been seeing this in North Carolina most certainly, as well as all throughout the U.S. And the Department of Energy's Sunshot goals are calling for large amounts of solar development by the year 2050. We've already achieved our PV cost reduction goals ahead of schedule, and I think we're going to see capacity continue to increase. And you'll notice that there's not quite enough space on rooftops throughout the U.S. for all the solar PV development, and so we will have to utilize utility scale projects on land in many areas. And this will, of course, require land in different parts of the United States. We're looking at up to around 6 million acres of land needed for solar by the year 2050. And so as part of that, we want to make sure that the land that's being used is being used responsibly, that the land after solar projects are decommissioned can be returned back to agriculture or whatever usage it was being used for before, and that the land can actually be in an improved state from what it once was before. A second motivation, and Rob showed a slide on this, is that you know, in the past, conventional utility scale generation has taken its inspiration from you know, basically residential housing development where land is really cleared completely and gravel is laid down for development of solar. What we want to do is transition away from that for something that really involves more integrated vegetation from the local habitat and local species that were there before. And this can provide a lot of different benefits, both of which Steve and Eason mentioned. And this is what we are terming low impact solar development. So we can avoid a lot of those challenges and a lot of the costs that are associated with a lot of machinery on sites, and provide a way to develop solar that is really integrated with the native surrounding landscapes. So as part of this, we are looking at defining really what is low impact site preparation, and it can be different from site to site, but a way in which we can look at this is don't do this, and instead do this. And for this, we can look at, you know, clearing and instead of clearing and removing the soil and the topsoil, we can work with existing vegetation, existing soil, and integrate the solar arrays around that, and actually use that vegetation to benefit the solar installation by providing cooler microclimate conditions, and also reducing costs associated with that large-scale machinery. We can also, instead of bringing in large-scale machinery that could compact the soil and grade the land, again, we work within the contours of the land. We utilize the benefits of that existing vegetation and its root structure to improve stormwater management. We can reduce the land footprint of this. We can encourage native vegetation and also reduce O&M costs. And so that is, on a very broad, brief level, what we mean by low impact site preparation. And by the way, again, as both Steve and Eason mentioned, there is a business case for this as well. One thing we are trying to do is really identify what are those simultaneous cost reductions that we can achieve while also minimizing environmental impacts. And this is especially going to be important going forward. As I mentioned, we've already achieved the cost reduction goals for PV modules as part of the Sunshot vision, which means that pretty soon site preparation costs will be about 1/5 of all utility scale PV costs. And so that means that the activities associated with soil management and grading and soil compaction will have an even higher percentage of their total costs on our system, meaning it becomes all the more important to look at ways to reduce that. We are identifying ways in which you can minimize those environmental impacts while also leading to those cost reduction strategies. And in cases where you might have an increase in costs up front, we are also evaluating the operational benefits from low impact site development. So you might have reduced O&M costs, and you also might have an increase in efficiency, a reduction in degradation, and less costs associated with land acquisition and permitting that could balance out and really make an even stronger business case for low impact site development. To do this, as I mentioned, our goal is to try to provide data and some robust science into this, so it's not just anecdotal or not just one-off projects. And so to do this, we are undertaking a variety of desktop analytical studies, looking at how different solar projects might shade areas and a lot of modeling. But a key part of what we're doing is associated with on-site field studies at individual projects that are either hosted by universities or by our industry partners, where we are working with them basically from the development and construction stage all the way through full implementation, and then again for approximately 3 years after installation to see how vegetation might perform underneath the solar arrays. And this is something that we are doing on a pretty large scale across the United States with a number of key partners. So we are working with the Argonne National Laboratory, as well as a number of universities and private companies in multiple states all throughout the U.S. At approximately, some of those on the map, you could see the location of where we're working. And some of those stars actually have multiple, they might have 2 or 3 sites associated with them. So we have over 15 different sites that we're working on, collecting data on vegetation, native vegetation performance, such as pollinator species underneath the solar arrays, to really get at the question, what types of pollinator species and pollinator vegetation habitat really thrives in these altered conditions, where you're going to have a little bit more shade, perhaps a little bit more humidity, changes in the climate, in the microclimate underneath the panels. And something that we have learned from this work is that the plants you think that will survive or that will thrive aren't necessarily the ones that do in the end. And so you really can only get at these types of questions through field studies in multiple locations with different types of soil and climate conditions. As part of this work, we recently released a report that highlights some of our methods for how we can evaluate vegetation underneath solar arrays. And so here's an example from our campus at NREL, where we're looking at vegetation underneath a 1 megawatt array on campus, and we have developed standard protocols for how to evaluate the vegetation performance, as well as how to design your study such that it can be robust enough and something that can be compared from location to location. This approach is what we are implementing on those 15 or more sites that I showed on the map earlier, so we can have a much broader suite of results that can really provide industry, state agencies, environmental groups, academia with much more solid information on how we can integrate solar development with pollinator habitat and other native vegetation. Also, part of what we are doing is looking at these detailed microclimate and soil characteristics and soil carbon issues to better understand how are conditions different underneath the solar array. So you might have lower temperatures during the day, but higher temperatures at night, which could actually help benefit crop production or vegetation production in many ways. We can also look at how much are we sequestering carbon. We can also look at other issues of how nutrients are moving throughout the soil, and after the solar project is decommissioned, how that soil might be in a different state, potentially improved after that solar project is gone. We are also doing a great amount of work with industry partners, again, working on their sites, and this has been a pretty straightforward collaboration where we work to identify sites with the companies that they are already working on, that are under construction. We also identify other local partners, so this could be seed mix providers, it could be local universities, it could be other partners that should be involved in this. And we do a little site survey, develop a study of design in conjunction with the developers, where we might look at a handful of different pollinator species in these sites in Oregon that are shown here that we're working with Pine Gate. We'll be growing different varieties of lavender, as well as different pollinator species, as well as other dryland agricultural crops underneath the arrays. And then we work to implement and monitor the vegetation, again, in a systematic and very tightly designed approach, such that the results here do provide broader impacts to the community. I will briefly go through some other options. I think what I want to make clear is that there are limitless variations and varieties of ways in which solar developers can integrate their activities with local agriculture, and that can be something as simple as growing pollinator habitat or vegetation underneath their solar arrays, as has been done in many different locations. But it also can include integrating with biofuel development. It can be integrating solar panels in unused portions of agricultural operations. It can also include growing crops for farmers markets or local restaurants underneath the panels. And this can be kale, broccoli, lettuces, beans, etc. It can also mean growing new types of crops in arid environments, like in Arizona. So this is one of our partners at the University of Arizona, where we are growing tomatoes and other crops underneath elevated solar panels. It also matches well with grazing in other arid environments. You can grow things like aloe vera or agave. And of course, there's a lot of greenhouses throughout the U.S. And we are partnering with Soliculture to look at how solar integrated with greenhouses can provide dual benefits as well. Now, upcoming research activities that we have include additional vegetation field studies that are focused on pollinator habitat. We are going to be doing more microclimate and soil conditions monitoring, looking at more detailed cost trade-off analyses that factor in various elements of upfront and ongoing and O&M costs, as well as a much more detailed study with Argonne National Lab on pollinator habitat and the broader economic and social impacts of solar projects, planting pollinator habitat, and then a series of low-impact solar development guidebooks that will be a useful resource for state agencies, federal agencies, industry, environmental groups, and other interested parties. The key takeaways I want everyone to have is that there are many different ways in which agriculture can benefit and can be integrated with solar energy development. Also, that solar projects can be designed in ways that simultaneously minimize environmental impacts as well as reduce their traditional costs, and that these cost trade-offs are an area that definitely needs more research, and that's something that we're tackling. And lastly, that additional test plots and new collaborations can really expand our depth of knowledge on this topic. As Eason mentioned, this is a relatively new topic, but it's expanding rapidly. We are trying to make sure all the developments, are providing some sort of information and insight to others, such that this can be developed in a way that really benefits local agriculture, pollinator habitat, pollinator species, as well as the surrounding communities in which solar development is happening. So with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions people might have, but otherwise I am looking forward to hearing more from the industry perspective.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Jordan. Really great content. And I'm just noticing that we are, of course, we're packing a 4-day symposium with a PhD and master's into a 2-hour webinar. So we're going to just continue the pace here and save questions for the end. I want to make sure that we continue to have time for Gavin of SoCore Energy and Mark of Prairie Restorations. They've really, put a lot of boots on the ground, a lot of tractors up and down rows, and a tremendous amount of acreage out there. Because when we're talking about pollinator habitat on solar arrays, we're more often talking about acres and equivalent to backyard gardens than we are about megawatts. Those are that's the language that people want to hear about more often. So before I transition to Gavin here, I just want to set up that in thinking about the how-to, it's really important to not leave your marketing team behind, to make sure, as Eason Case from Cypress Creek Renewables highlighted, that you're doing a ribbon cutting and you're really taking a victory lap on these projects. It's a great opportunity to educate consumers and the communities about the benefits that solar arrays can provide, about how they can be designed to look, like this. We would love to see, all of this work result in a lot fewer headlines like this about, neighborhoods expressing concern about the ways that some solar projects are designed. So, a couple of firms that have, I think, done a really good job in helping to tell their story. Certainly Dairyland Power in Wisconsin and throughout parts of Minnesota and Iowa. This is their CEO, Barb Nick, and over her left shoulder on the right side of the screen, you see she's talking about, their new portfolio of solar projects and how, they came, with an extraordinary amount of high quality pollinator habitat. Also, Greg Ritterbush of Connexus Energy has been a real leader in this topic. They seeded their array, which is this picture here in 2014. And, Connexus has been really savvy, and they've significantly benefited, with, publicity in Modern Farmer and Smithsonian Magazine and Sustainable Brands and Martha Stewart and National Geographic. So just, tremendous community engagement and media coverage simply because of some different and unusual, unexpected practices in managing solar arrays. This is an internal communications piece that Connexus sent to their customers to highlight the fact that they're helping to save pollinators at scale. So, with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Gavin, and I will welcome your contribution to this important topic, and thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. I appreciate it, Rob. So you've also got Mark on the phone. He's with Prairie Restorations, is a company that we've partnered with a lot to really kind of figure out how to implement pollinator habitat on solar projects. Kind of just really one of the main reasons we sort of started looking at this is there's, I guess my background was mostly in commercial development before coming to the industry, 2.5 years ago or so. And this was an approach that we implemented in commercial development in like large areas with detention ponds and large long corridors, rights of ways, as we really saw as like a a positive and a cost savings from a maintenance perspective. And I think solar provides, certain challenges, obviously like the height of the panels and things that we need to avoid. But we started working with Prairie just to kind of like learn and see if this is something that we could implement about 2.5 years ago, really as a partnership. So they've really been great about kind of looking at kind of what our needs are as an industry and trying to find ways that we can make quality habitat and also meet, the budgets and some of the requirements that we have in the industry. And so they've been great about that. And I think one of the critical things I think in this industry is that we really need to be really open as far as knowledge sharing and just trying to figure this out, because I think the only way to kind of push this idea forward is to kind of learn from our mistakes. And also just, I think that's one of the great things about working with Prairie so far is it's kind of been a give and take. It's been really super flexible. Mark, I know you had some stuff to add about as far as kind of what you've seen as kind of the most important things as far as, collaboration and communication.
Right. Thanks, Gavin. Yeah, I'm looking at the picture on the screen, and I do want to say the presentation Jordan just made when he had that was an excellent presentation, and the height of the solar panels, which I'll probably focus on a little bit more during this talk, almost made me cry, because the higher you get them up, the better they're going to be. It allows us to do way more things in there. Some of the things when we started working with Gavin and SoCor and some of the other ones, it was a new opportunity for us. I mean, it's turned out wonderfully. We've learned a lot of things. We've had to adapt to a lot of things. One of the things I want to focus on is adaptive management. As you see them looking, it's a deal where we can get on site, we can take a look at it. First things we look at is how high are the panels. So what kind of equipment can we get in there? What kind of soil types are there? Just figuring out what the developer wants. So we're looking at key thing, which I think Gavin said was collaboration and communication is key, and that's also willingness to be flexible. Each site's going to be unique, no matter how much we plan or design. We're probably going to have to make changes throughout the course of it to make things work well.
So just kind of really important. Sorry, go ahead. I guess what we did is we kind of broke the presentation up in these 5 different kind of sections, just to kind of talk about just like the different groups and I guess different approaches that are really critical. And I think the one thing that both Mark and I want to kind of explain is that we don't have this all figured out yet. It's not a perfect system, and I think I kind of constantly being in communication on a site, coming up with creative solutions. I think it's putting the right people with the right knowledge kind of in a group together to try to figure out what is the best way to approach this. This has been over, the benefits of this approach as far as pollinator habitat on solar. There's an array of lists here. Jordan focused on kind of just talking about coming up with the actual data to kind of back up some of these benefits, and I think quantifying these in the future is going to be something that's going to be critical to really helping us kind of move this forward. And so I just kind of wanted to list these out so you guys would have them in the presentation when you have a copy of it. But these are some of the options that what we're using to kind of sell this approach to both our clients and to the community, jurisdictions that we're working with. This is one of the first projects that we did with Prairie Restoration. And back in, it's September 2017, you can kind of see the site. We had originally planted a cover crop on it. But you can see during construction just how much damage actually occurs. And so what was really critical is just kind of, really working together to figure out what the best way to kind of plant the site was. There's several different seed mixes on the site based on different soil conditions, how wet and moist the soil is. And then what we're kind of blown away with is even only a year later, we're seeing results like this on some of our sites. And I mean, it's definitely varied. It's not going to be ideal on every site. And I think one of the key things to note is one of the little things that Prairie kind of offered as something to help us explain is kind of what to expect. It's like the pollinator habitat is really kind of like year one, you're really going to see it. They say it's going to sleep. Year two, it's going to creep. And then year three, it's going to leap. So they really, the first 1 or 2 growing seasons, you're going to see somewhat limited growth sometimes because the roots are growing. And that's where kind of all the energy is focused, really getting the proper root base so that the vegetation, has a good root base. But basically, like, that's been something that's been really interesting as far as our communication has been concerned. And then, Mark, I think you were going to talk to us a little bit about what kind of the importance of kind of planning ahead and early involvement.
Yeah, and that's when we look at these sites. I mean, as you guys you get the sites, and you're working to get the proposal put together, get the permitting. Sometimes these sites can sit a little bit of a time, so they're not being actively managed or cropped. So you can end up having some of the weed growth come up. And what's nice for us, the site preparation is just as important as the seeding or the outcome at the end. If we can't take care of some of these annual weeds or perennial weeds, perennial being one of our nemesis, Canada thistle, if we can't get that under control before the solar installation, then we have more obstacles to work around before we can, if the whole thing is installed, for us just to come in and seed is impossible because we'll be fighting all these weeds all the time. So if we can get involved early on and do either mowings on annuals or herbicide applications, during the course of the installation, it's going to be a much more successful outcome at the end. Sometimes, I mean, this is a site planning and prep. The herbicide applications, the other thing is what kind of soil types do we have? If we have heavy soils like we do in Minnesota, with all the construction traffic, it can compact the soil. So we have to get in there and try and use the right size equipment to crack those soils, break up the decompaction, and return it so it can grow things, at a more normal rate. You can imagine we would like to get in and do everything before the panels go in, but we're always last. It's the best place for us to be. And when we get in and we do the prep, we get everything taken care of, we will give you, a successful project.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you've seen is doing your herbicide, doing mowings and herbicide treatments kind of even before construction begins has been something that's been really helpful, or going out and planting cover crop to kind of deter weed growth. So there's been a lot of things we can do before the contractor even gets on site to kind of plan for a better solution at the end and not to have to work around the array as much as far as kind of weed mitigation and things.
Right. The point being that as long as we're involved at the startup, and we work in collaboration, we have a much more successful project. Seed mix design, this is something we discussed the other day, and I think it was mentioned before. Seed mix on these, I mean, we're talking about what the inventory is every year. I see a lot of people are designing, some of the best seed mixes that they would want or what would historically be on site. And by the time it goes through the process, the inventory of what was available for that year may be diminished. So it's when the seed mixes are put together, what I ask people is, don't be so set on it, because by the time we get approval to go ahead and purchase the seed, some of those inventories are going to go down. And it is like, what's on the shelf today may not be on the shelf tomorrow. So it is for the seed mix design and approval. As soon as that project is ready to go, people that are involved in approvals or permitting need to understand that it's rapid decisions have to be made so we can secure the seed to have for the site. Design too is also, the higher the panels, the more diversity we can have in choosing plants. When we have low panels, then you're into, the shortest species you can have. And from my experience, the shorter they are, the less available they are and the less seed they produce. So it is, higher panels and then figure out what you can fit into the seed mix.
And I think as an industry, one of the great things we can do is if we have PPAs that are signed early, we can design a seed mix early. We could purchase seeds in advance. Anything that we can plan ahead, even if the build's a year out. The more we can do to kind of help kind of purchase from our suppliers and let them know that this demand, I think it'll help us ramp up and maybe help with that potential supply chain. I guess fear that we're just not sure if the demand's basically we can meet the demand. So I think that's one of the things we can do as an industry is if we have contracts, we can go ahead and purchase seeds and set them aside so that they can ramp up as well. As far as permitting, I think this is something that Rob kind of touched on, and I just think it's really important to kind of work with your development staff as far as the benefits from a stormwater, environmental, and just even aesthetic benefits. And just kind of working with your, the different authorities that you're going through permitting with, kind of so they understand the benefits. And, that's kind of the critical thing that Jordan was talking about too, is kind of recognizing the benefits. Is this is not going to be, like from an initial cost, it's not going to be less expensive. So if we're going to make these spends, we might as well let it count for us. I think one of the biggest problems that, or kind of issues I've run into is, this really has like huge stormwater effects, and we're really focusing on doing low impact development. But a lot of the stormwater manuals are written so that depending on whether they count impervious areas for the panels and whatnot, they're kind of forcing BMP design, which is just the opposite of an actual low impact development, kind of in my opinion. And so those are kind of some of the things that I think if you can kind of communicate through the different authorities that you're working with, I'm hoping that kind of as the industry goes, we can actually capture the benefits, and it'll make this even more cost effective. And I think you already touched on kind of just early purchasing, but I guess the only thing from a permitting perspective is if your authorities having jurisdiction do require review of the seed mix, I just suggest that we somehow kind of include an adjustment for substitution, things like that, because if you're not buying the seeds in early enough, it can cause a delay in your project as far as having to go back through that process to get a seed approval again. And we've seen that delay as much as 2 or 3 months, and so that can be kind of critical, especially when it comes to establishing vegetation for your stormwater management plans.
That's a very key point, Gavin. It is, like you said, there's the inventories will change from day to day, and a lot of it can get bound down on the layers of contractors. So it's like if you can, what I say is just make friends with all the people that are doing the permitting and approval, because a lot of people have opinions on what's going to grow out there, and we can find the right seed mix that's going to fit there. But a lot of times it's just getting it approved quickly so you can secure everything.
And Gavin, I'd like to hop in. This is Rob Davis. I'd just like to hop in and comment on that slide specifically. Something that we really learned from the United Kingdom and folks in Europe is that if you're a planner, if you're tuned in today to think about this from a planning perspective, or a local authority, what you want to be doing is in the United States is saying that these projects or the vegetation on and around these projects shall be beneficial to pollinators, and leave it at that, because you don't want to be in the position of figuring out what's beneficial to pollinators. The reason we came up, we're advancing the scorecard in a wide variety of states and ecoregions is because we're soliciting the input of the world's foremost entomologists to develop that. And so in growing number of communities in Minnesota, that rather than be prescriptive about a particular seed mix, which was an approach that was done in the United Kingdom, and it had terrible consequences. It resulted in those specific seed mixes going way up in cost, there being national shortages on those specific seed mixes. So, if you're making conditions for these sites, or if you're doing, planning and ordinances regarding the solar development, then you just want to be focused on the outcome, which is that the projects shall be beneficial to pollinators, and then get out of the way and let the entomologists decide, how that's done.
Great, thanks, Ron. One of the things Marcus kind of touched on quite it's quite significant as far as the height or the leading edge of your panel, whether it's a tracker system or a fixed tilt system or any other, I guess, type. And I think one of the things that I think that we're finding is pretty critical is probably a 36-inch height is almost a minimum that you'd like to go to get the diversity that you'd like from the seed mix. And just to give you guys, like, we've done some studies just looking at kind of what that cost is, because in the Midwest, there's certain areas that we're required basically 36 inches just to kind of, not really required, but I guess just to account for, snow loads or not snow loads, but snow drift and things like that to kind of avoid shading. But we're finding that, the higher you can get the panels, it's really going to increase your diversity and then also decrease your maintenance over time because you can allow for some more growth during the growing season. And Mark,
that's the design. I mean, you've heard me say it, just like Gavin said. We did a project where some of the panels, the front edges was only 12 inches off the ground. And I know the people that are managing it now wish they were higher. You can imagine the problems we had trying to modify equipment to get underneath those panels just to even take care of the weed growth beforehand. When they get higher, your availability or your ability to use different equipment goes way up. And like I said before, the different varieties and species of plants you can use, doubles, triples.
Yeah, and just as far as the costs are concerned, what we're seeing just on the different, kind of cost, kind of just exercises that we've done is like a fixed tilt system for a 1 megawatt AC. You're only seeing about $1,000 a foot, basically, to raise it for each foot that you want to go for 1 megawatt. For a tracker system, you're looking, it's significantly more, but it's around $3,200. But I think as far as long-term maintenance, I think you can recover those costs because those are, less or equivalent to potentially like one site visit or one mowing, potentially. So I think those are some of the things that we should be kind of considering. And generally, the next few slides are what we're trying to focus on is what can we do during the design phase to kind of accommodate and help the management, vegetation management company to really kind of save us money and save them time and money as well. I know, Mark, this is one of the issues you guys have run into as far as having trouble getting equipment around the site.
Yeah, and I'll probably just start to run with this, so you'll have to slow me down at some point, Gavin. So when we get on these sites, we either have to prepare the soil, do herbicide applications, anything like that. We fully understand that these things are put in so you can produce power. And the afterthought is the vegetation or the fencing or all that stuff. But when you look at them, here's a case where the chain link was designed to put in here, but the space between this solar panel and chain link, we can't get anything in there. So it is all of a sudden you're having more costs or more time just to work this by hand or trying to figure out a different seed mix for it. This one is on the back of the panel. You'll have to think about when you have your rows and you get down to the rows, see if we could run up and down the aisles with equipment, and we have to make many trips to do the installation and the management. When you get to the aisles, you have to be able to turn your tractor and your equipment around. So, I mean, if you can, get the chain link away from the end of the panels, just think about what your biggest piece of equipment is that you're going to work, and that's what your spacing should be. I think you can go to the next one, Gavin. So here's just a situation we've run into where the plan was to, screen the solar field from local residents. So the berm got put in, and then they put sumac and spruce on top of it. But I think there may have been a little miscommunication on how close to put the berm to the chain link, because now we have a 45-degree angle pitch that goes down to the chain link. We can't get any equipment in there at all. So, I mean, we're going to have to just figure out a different seed mix for that and then manage it as it comes. These are all the things that, if we get involved early, we can probably draw attention to those things, and it could be a minor change. This is, I know Gavin put this one in here just for me. This is a case where you see the combiner box on the piling of the solar panel, and you can look down that aisle, and you're looking at the width of it, is even all the way down. So when we can, design or redesign equipment that can be the most efficient, we can literally, we have the same width all the way. On some projects, you will see the combiner boxes are they're offset, underneath the upper edge, or there are different things put in, different signs, a lot of different obstacles. So you can imagine when we have to get down there, we have to design equipment or use equipment for the narrowest point. So if you can keep them consistent and wide, you're lowering your costs for us to seed and for us to manage it over the long term. Probably go to the next, yep. Soil and water management. I mean, this gets in, again, when these sites, a lot of the ones we're seeing up here, the solar sites, from farmers, they're probably not the most productive corn and soybean fields. So what they are, they usually have quite a bit of terrain to them, and maybe the soils are a little different. So in order to get your SWIP permits, I mean, there's going to have to be silt fence, there's going to have to be drainage swales, erosion blanket and all this. But you can start to see where the meanders come in and the pinch points to be able to get your equipment in. If we're in on the front end of it, and we'll probably notice that right away, whereas everybody else is looking at the solar panels. If we can get in and get the seeding in before the blanket or the straw wattles go in, it's already going to be ahead of the game, especially outside of the solar array, or if we're working outside of the chain link fence. We could do that in one phase and then come back and do the solar array in a different phase. You can move on. So construction and installation, so I kind of wandered into that just a bit ago. You can see in the bottom right, I mean, these are all these tractors. These are your mid-sized tractors. And that's probably the biggest equipment that you can use on these solar arrays. The harrows, I mean, it's all small equipment. It's not like the big, you see these 12-wheel tractors running through the fields these days. Everything we have is this size. So it fits the solar arrays. We can do, good, proper work with it. Lower right is just, preparing soil. Upper right is broadcast seeding. And on the left is a flail mower. And these are everything we need. They fit your projects perfectly. Construction, what we don't have it here is if we get into compacted soils, we will have what we call, they're the chisel plows, or rippers, as we've called them. They're just the shanks, the box blade, that we have to get out there because of all the construction that has happened. In order to put the arrays up, we have to come back, and we can't just seed on top of compacted soil. It has to be a case where we're going to prep it first. And if you get into real heavy soils, you're going to have big chunks of dirt, so you have to break them down into smaller to have a proper seed bed.
And I think the only thing I have to add here is I think one of the other things you mentioned was just how critical it is to stay in contact with the contractor and not let the weeds kind of build up on site. I think one of the critical things, if you use kind of the incorrect type of mowers, there's a sickle mower that just kind of cuts everything off at the bottom and then it lays and creates a layer. So when it comes to actual seeding during construction, the seeds actually, when you broadcast, they don't make it in contact with the soil because there's a layer. So it's some simple things like that can kind of cause some major problems on the site that are very difficult to fix once you've made that mistake. So just something else to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Gavin. I mean, it is, as long as we're in touch with each other during the whole thing, we can make those decisions and prevent problems from happening in the future.
And then I think the other thing was
active management. We've talked about that before, and it is the case of, getting in touch with the people in the early stages of the project. And I think we were talking with someone else the other day, and they were talking about, doing the site surveys and looking at 2-foot intervals on topography, and it didn't identify the site quite enough. We do end up, especially in heavy soil situations, you'll all of a sudden have drainage or ponds where you didn't used to have them. And that is something that obviously if you run into a pond in the middle of an alley when you're seeding, you're going to have to make some changes. Gavin, I think you had more to talk about on this one.
No, I think I wanted you to just kind of run through what I guess should typically expect. I know we're not 100% sure on this, but as far as kind of during an establishment period, I think one of the critical things I don't know if we've mentioned yet is that, the real main focus is like for this vegetation is really putting in the time and energy during the establishment period, which kind of ranges anywhere from 3 to 4 years. And so I just kind of like you to talk a little bit about like what's required during the establishment period versus long term as far as number of visits and kind of what you'd be doing, I guess.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so we've kind of beaten the install part, the soil prep, herbicide, all that is key. That is critical to get the work done before we do the actual seeding. Once the seeding is put in, and we will always put a cover crop of oats or wheat with it, because the first year, the first growing season, the native plants will grow roots, and their top could be maybe only 2 inches tall. So it is, as people have said before, it can look pretty rough the first year. And the cover crop's in there to produce shade for these new plantings, and it's also there to stabilize the soil. Now, the first thing that happens is when the oats or wheat get up, they call it the milk stage, is when they're just starting to head out, is about the time we go through and do a complete site mow. And we'll mow the cover crop, and usually there's annual weeds such as lamb's quarter. We'll mow that down to a 3 to 4 inch height. And that's where we use the flail mowers or something that actually chews up the vegetation, because if we just hit it with a sickle mower, which is like you've seen, hay fields, it just lays down, it will suffocate things. So the flail mowers will chop it up. It just makes a nice mulch layer. It still provides cooling for these new plants, but it takes away the competition for these plants to get sun and keep on developing. The site mow we'll do like every month and a half. For us, if it's a spring seeding, we'll probably we'll probably mow in June, and then every month and a half until we get into September. And that takes care of the different seasons and the different annual weeds and perennial weeds. Now, the reason we do not use herbicide the first year is the new prairie plants, prairie grasses, and flowers don't tolerate herbicide very well, even selective, broadleaf herbicides. So we save that for the second year. The beginning of the second growing season, we'll usually, in June again, we'll probably hit it with a complete site mow, because we will get the annual weeds are coming up. And it gives it a jump start. Usually your cool season plants will start early. For us, it's April, May they start. And the warm season, which is most of the prairie plants, really start to grow late May and June. So if we're setting back the annuals, we're giving a boost to what we want, the annual weeds. We give a boost to the prairie plants. The second and third visits of the year, and in North Carolina, you could end up having or counting on a fourth visit just because of your longer growing season. Then we can get in and we will start with what we call spot mowings and spot herbicide applications. And that's just if you have seen the site enough times, you kind of know where your problem areas are. You have to cover the whole thing, so you're taking care of anything that's going to cause problems. But you're out there just hitting selectively, areas. At the same time, you're inspecting the site, so you know where to add seed. The third year and probably into the fourth, your prairie and your native planting is maturing, and it's starting to fill in. Your patience is paying off. You're starting to get the picture you see in front of you, the black-eyed Susans, and everything is starting to close in on the ground. You're getting a nice cover. Everything's out competing the weeds, and we know what's going on with your site. When you get into later years, then it's pretty mature. They still need to have management. There's no such thing as a no maintenance planting. But your costs go way down, because usually it's just we can go through, monitor, pick out the problem areas and just work on those and don't have to cover the whole site. We do probably recommend, one of the things for prairie is, fire is probably one of the best tools for it. Obviously, we are not burning in a solar field. So we'll have to imitate that reduction of, the old growth with a mowing, or properly timed mowing. Now, whether we do that in the spring or late fall, I think will be determined site by site. But hopefully that gives you an idea. I mean, we could talk about this for a long time. Hopefully it gives you an idea what happens, especially the first 3 to 4 years. When they become mature, the adaptive management takes over.
And I think one of the critical things that you just kind of started alluding to is just that I think the one thing we want to be very clear about is that the whole point of kind of installing the habitat is so that during the growing season, you know, the habitat is actually available and being, you know, and impacting, I guess, the surrounding areas. So we want to make sure that we're kind of not, you know, we do plan our mows at the beginning or end of the season. If there is some height issues, maybe we can do like smaller strip mowing, like right just in front of the panels at like leading edge, for example. But we just really want to kind of avoid the idea of just mowing it 3 times a year, you know, to kind of keep it below 12 inches or something, if that's were the case, you know, because it's really kind of defeating the whole purpose and the whole intent here. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Exactly, and I think that's where we kind of fill the niche of working with the developers, the early construction people, and then the management people that have to take care of the site for 20 years is get on early and let them know, you know, what's going to happen, understand what their concerns are, and then work with everyone to make sure we have solar production and we have pollinator production.
Yeah, this is kind of something interesting. I thought I'd show you guys this quick 16-second video, but this is like a new a new piece of equipment that I've seen that's being used on a lot of solar sites. It's just kind of interesting because it actually gets right around the posts. So there's something I wanted to share real quick.
And that Gavin just put that in yesterday. And with what we have up in Minnesota, I mean, we get a lot of, you know, annual weed growth underneath the panels. And this was a situation where you, no matter how much we try and fix or adapt other equipment, to get right underneath those panels was kind of a problem. This is a mower that's actually built in Holland. It's called an orchard mower, and it has that swing arm that can get underneath. I mean, you can only go a maximum of 2 miles an hour, but it does take care. It reaches underneath as long as the panels are high enough, and does a really nice job. It's a great addition to our fleet.
I think we'll just this is just kind of basically kind of where we're at as far as SoCor and Prairie. Like at the end of this year, SoCor and Prairie together will have installed, you know, 500 acres of native habitat that we're managing. Prairie, and within their portfolio, has an additional 800 acres. So we've committed, I guess, at this point is the point I'm trying to make. And I think we are definitely convinced that this is something worth doing. And I think we have, you know, we've learned a lot. There's a lot left to learn. But I think that it's something, I think the most important things that we've learned so far is just how important it is to communicate kind of in starting early, and just really committing to the necessary management during the establishment period. Making sure you design the system so that it kind of minimizes maintenance and maximizes diversity, and then also just remaining kind of flexible. Each site is going to be unique. You're going to find that on your portfolio, I think you'll see things balancing out. But, you know, we've definitely got some problem sites, and then we've got certain sites that are just kind of, that have just taken off, and there's no maintenance, you know, never mind, I take that back. No, not no maintenance, but definitely more minimal than the others. Mark, do you have anything to add?
Collaboration between the developers and the people that are going to take care of your pollinators, I mean, is key. And I want to thank Gavin for putting this together and all the people on the webinar. It's been a great webinar. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's all we have.
Thank you so much. We're really delighted to have you and learn from your expertise in this area and in all of this work. I want to take some time now to open it up to questions, and also, as you're thinking of questions, if the topic of pollinators is the reason you signed up for the webinar today, whether you're coming from a farming background or, you know, are more concerned with the conservation land ethic, or both, Just the acres that Gavin and Mark talked about, 800 acres and 1,300 acres and 500 acres, that total is equivalent to, more than 750,000 homes, each having a 6-foot by 12-foot pollinator garden. So, and considering where we're at, where the industry is at, is that you think about a year from now, and 2 years from now, and 3 years from now, that we will put more and more and more acres and points on the board, so that when Jordan talks about 6 million acres in solar by 2050, we'll be able to say, yeah, and how many of those are significantly benefiting, pollinators and other wildlife that are critical to agriculture and certainly critical to our quality of life that we want to maintain. Whether it's the butterflies and the monarchs or the native birds that are important to you, pollinator-friendly solar is a way to put habitat in the ground at scale in a way that can significantly help. Also, I just want to highlight that if you are fanatical and really enthusiastic about pollinator-friendly solar, the best thing that you can do is to show up to a local zoning meeting and significantly and strongly support solar projects that are built with these practices. There's a lot of misinformation out there, as every solar developer will tell you. It's all over the Facebook and social media about these sites, but we're delighted to present this really grounded, practical, science-based information in partnership with Audubon and other entomologists and agricultural experts on ways that solar can coexist with agriculture and conservation. Maybe Jordan, could I pass the first question to you? These are a pair of questions, actually. Noting that Boulder, so at your Boulder facility where you've got that vegetation study going on, you've got about 20 inches of annual rainfall there. So, were those plants that are under that solar array, were they irrigated? And could you talk about the fire risk?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. Yeah, so our general principle when we look at growing native vegetation underneath solar arrays is to not utilize any sort of additional irrigation. So everything that we do is meant to, be, native species that are used to thriving under whatever conditions have been, climatic conditions have been there. And so, no, when in our Colorado sites and all of our other sites, we don't supplement any additional irrigation. One of the benefits that we have seen so far from planting vegetation underneath solar arrays, and this has been from our work in measuring soil moisture, so in water infiltration rates into soil, some of the microclimate conditions, is that we do see that underneath the solar arrays, you do have generally cooler conditions during the day and higher levels of soil moisture because you're having less, evaporation basically, and a little bit less transpiration. And so you actually need less water for those same varieties of species to thrive. And so this actually benefits, a number of different things. It allows you to have better plant production growth even during times of drought. It also provides somewhat of a barrier against fires. And so you asked the question about, is there a fire risk? What we have seen is that we think there's actually, less of a fire risk within that solar array that has vegetation than in the surrounding area that doesn't have the solar array. And this is something that, Australia looked at a couple of years ago, and they found the same thing, that, you're much more of a risk of having a fire outside of the solar array where you don't have any of that protection and you might have drier conditions than you do within the solar array. And so when we look at fire risks, I think you see more of a risk of fire, entering the solar array from outside the facility rather than a fire somehow starting within the solar array. And I will say fires at solar installations are extremely rare. Obviously they do happen just like they happen at any sort of house or building or power plant, nuclear, coal power plant, wherever. You're going to have a fire every once in a while, but they're extremely rare. And we haven't really seen having native vegetation underneath the arrays increase that risk, partly due to the fact that you are changing the microclimate underneath there, leading to a little bit more humid and cooler, and having more soil moisture in those conditions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jordan. Mark, could you speak about Palmer amaranth and, whether these sites are, just kind of let loose for Palmer to spread and propagate? For folks on the call, Palmer amaranth is a particularly invasive weed that is noxious in some states and fast growing and gets a bit woody. It's a real problem in soybean and corn fields where it can damage combines. Mark, could you talk about that?
Just briefly, up here, we're just starting to see it come into this area. I've seen it in some of the soybean fields. What I will say about what we do, especially with the solar fields or any of the projects we manage, is our management takes care of it. We're always identifying these areas, and our 2 or 3 site visits a year, we're identifying those and we're taking care of it. So that's about all I can say for you right now.
Yeah, and I'll add some to that and just talk about the critical importance of having a good seed supplier or having a really trustworthy source for quality seeds and vetting that source. There's been some seed mixes that have had trace amounts of Palmer spread. That's happened in Iowa and in Minnesota in some circumstances. But certainly these situations are actively managed to remove noxious and invasive species. So another question came in about fencing. Maybe Mark, I could pass that to you as well to talk about just the wildlife fencing that you've seen versus the chain link fencing, or maybe Gavin, that would be better for you. You've probably seen a bunch of different fence styles and designs.
Gavin, I guess, I'll pass that one to you.
Okay. We've definitely installed several different kinds of fence. It's usually driven by the zoning authority. That's kind of whether they're willing to allow, barbed wire, for example. The minimum that we've generally designed to, based on our assumptions or our interpretation of the code, is a 7-foot high fence. So whether it's barbed wire or not, game fencing or some other type of fencing, it's typically we're going with 7 feet. So I'm not sure if it's a security question, a safety question though, or a cost thing. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it seems that the question on the fencing is actually, does it limit the ability of pollinators to utilize the site? But I think that for certainly all of those options, particularly for the game fence, where there's a little bit more roosting opportunity for birds. The fence does not inhibit the travel of honeybees or native bees whatsoever. So the pollinators are going to go where they're going to go, and the fence is just not going to inhibit them one bit. But certainly in local communities, the game fences can provide some additional roosting opportunities for birds. And then let's see, another question.
Actually, before you go, this is Alan. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Just on the fencing issue, I just wanted to note that a lot of those are requirements that are set either by the National Electric Code or by the local utility that you're interacting with. And so whatever option you're looking at, make sure you satisfy those requirements first, or you're going to have to take some fencing down.
Yep. There's a question about the risk of attracting endangered and threatened pollinator species. I'll comment on it first, and I welcome others' feedback. This is definitely an issue that's being led by EPRI with regards to transmission corridors and distribution corridors as well. It's a much bigger issue than just solar arrays. Particularly looking at the potential Endangered Species Act listing of the monarch butterfly, if that happens, there will be massive and widespread changes to agricultural practices. So, solar is just a tiny percent of the landscape, and will only ever be that. So if we get into situations where increasing situations where we're having to manage listed species, just know that there's a huge community. The Right-of-Way Habitats Council is meeting on Thursday of this week in Illinois to discuss these issues. But certainly the largest utilities and transmission line companies in America, as well as just distribution, transmission, and DOTs are really thinking about that, because it does drive up costs. There's a number of ways that industry can get involved to make sure that they're getting credit, and EPRI is taking a great leadership position in helping to explore those solutions. Either other panelists want to comment on that?
This is Greg at Audubon. I'll just say that, there is a lot of concern about, species being listed in the future, and that has a much bigger impact on business operations than fear of hosting those species in the short term. And so really, from the folks that we work with, really everyone's trying to boost these populations in the short term to make sure that they're not listed, as opposed to, having fear that, they're going to be hosting species on their site and be subject to additional regulation in the future. I think there's more concern about them being listed in the first place. And so anything that we can do together to ensure that that doesn't happen, including really boosting productivity of these sites in the short term and making sure that those populations stabilize or increase, is very important.
And also, I think something that's related is just because it's often, is an issue that goes to the lawyers, is not just the ESA listing potential, but also that OSHA, the reality is that, an untreated bee sting, if someone has an anaphylactic shock, that is a OSHA reportable incident. This is really critical to keep in the broader context, that if you're bitten by a mosquito, or you have an employee that's bitten by a mosquito and they contract Zika, or if they're bitten by a tick and they contract Lyme's disease, those are also OSHA reportable incidents. For the companies that I believe Prairie Restorations work with, that it's puts a greater emphasis potentially on working with a contractor and working with trained staff who know how to manage themselves when working in the natural landscape, to really minimize those risks and make sure that the utility or the electric provider isn't unduly exposing their employees to risk, and that's a training opportunity. But again, that's a significantly bigger issue than just limited to solar. Gavin, could you speak to wildlife fences for mammals? Whether you're seeing fences more that are raised off the ground a couple of inches, or seeing little passageways in through projects or the divide projects.
Yeah, we really look really what's adjacent to the project. Is there habitat around that makes sense? And if so, then yeah, we'll raise the fences slightly. And then kind of the connection of any kind of green. If we have, for example, like a wetland, that maybe kind of snakes through the site that we're avoiding with our project, but just also along that green space, we'll raise the fence in those sections so that anything kind of traveling through the site can still get through. That's how we've been just kind of approaching it on a site by site, just trying to use our common sense. Because a lot of the areas, I think you all are aware, when we're working in a smaller towns, sometimes agriculture areas that don't have the most sophisticated permitting and environmental systems. So I think it's really on us to kind of do our research to make sure that we're protected, and kind of working with all of our third-party consultants to make sure we're doing the right thing.
Thank you, Gavin, and thanks so much to Greg and Steve, all of our panelists and our hosts Such a great time. You all have now, I think, honorary PhDs in pollinator-friendly solar. Go forth, use them well, and when you run into roadblocks, here's the contact information for each of our panelists. Please do reach out. We're building a great community. It's, it's significantly larger than it was a year ago this time, and it will be significantly larger a year into the future. Thank you so much for your time.